Thank you so much. It's a great joy to be with you in my original home city. I'm a Londoner. I've been out of London for 30 years, but as people often tell me in Birmingham, you haven't lost your accent. I had 10 years in West Yorkshire, kind of in those last 30 years too. So it's just lovely to be back here in London. I've been given the task of speaking very briefly about where is the church called to organise and speak up for justice. And I think what I want to do this afternoon is share some of my own journey and story and some of the things that I have been involved in, some of the things that in particular churches together in England are involved in, and perhaps some of the key issues that we all need to be engaged in. And I'm going to particularly focus my talk around three areas. Three is good if you're a Pentecostal preacher. And so I'm going to focus around racial justice. I'm also going to focus around the Ukraine refugee crisis, and I want to finish with the cost of living crisis. It was a great privilege to be earlier in the session that Richard Reddy took on racial justice, and that was a fascinating conversation and really set the scene for some of what I perhaps want to start off by focusing on. But as I think of racial justice, I think of George Floyd's murder, which was a moment that I think lit a touch paper in the conscience not only of people in this country, not only of the church, but all around the world. And I remember when those awful images flashed across my screen and all of our screens because we were in lockdown. I remember the feeling of personal racialized trauma as a black man. I also remember my phone just beginning to ring as people wanted to talk and to share, and realized that as a pastor I had pastoral responsibility, not only for people in my own congregation, but people generally who knew me and just wanted someone to talk to. But I also quickly realized that there needed to be a prophetic response. And I do want to say that the prophetic voice of the church is absolutely essential. And so together with 5 leaders, a couple of Baptists, I love the Baptists, in fact 3 Baptists, because they are just seen for me to be very much having activism in their blood. Another Pentecostal, actually, from an African Pentecostal church in Edinburgh, and myself. We got together and we decided, do you know what? We are going to protest in Parliament Square, and we are going to lead other Christians to do the same. And I think the first lesson I learnt as we kind of began to pull that together is go with the willing, leave others to wring their hands. Because 1 or 2 people rang and said, oh, well, you can't do this. These people need to be involved. Those people need to be involved. And if you waited for the last people to catch the train, well, the train would never leave the station. And I just find that when God puts on your heart a particular issue, that suddenly you will face those who oppose the position, perhaps, that you're taking. You will have others who perhaps want to be a bit protective of their own role and position in the whole thing. But really importantly, there's an important role that we need to play as enabling leaders in releasing new voices. And I'm so excited with the numbers of new voices that are speaking up about racial justice in a way that previously 2 years ago they simply wouldn't done. I was just picking up on Twitter the other day, a good friend of mine, Deborah Green, who many of you know, taking the knee on stage at a key event. Suddenly there's someone over the last couple of years who's become a real ally around racial justice, the importance of new voices. Secondly, I've recognised that it's really important we engage with social media. It's such a powerful tool for building momentum. I remember when we picked up and had the march in Parliament Square and down Whitehall, outside 10 Downing Street, where we nearly got in trouble with the police, but we moved on at the right time, I think, and down to Trafalgar Square, where we had some further speeches. But we really built a lot of our momentum for a Facebook group that we set up. And 3 things I've learned about engaging with social media. Don't argue with bots, and there are lots of them out there. But also it's important to build a real kind of sense of people owning the issue beyond your own echo chamber. Really easy to speak to your own echo chamber, but actually we are called to build wider alliance. And thirdly, that you can't champion everything. I'm passionate about lots of things, but actually, what's the key thing that God is calling you to do? The other thing I learned is the importance of dealing, what I describe as dealing with your own demons. Because one of the things that really struck me as the whole movement of Black Lives Matter began to develop, I began to think of the times when I'd sat in rooms that I'd heard things that I was uncomfortable with, and I'd just let it go. And so I decided to put something out on social media. And it was really interesting. It was just a confession. At the times, I had turned a blind eye when I should have challenged issues of racial injustice or inappropriate things that had been said over 30 years of ministry and before I was ministry in the room. And it was very interesting that when I did that, suddenly I found that it gave other people permission to do the same and to go through the same process. Sometimes what God will do in our lives, when we share it humbly and vulnerably, actually gives other people permission to take the same journey as well. The personal is political, and so your own journey is relevant for your own credibility. Building broad coalition on any issue is really, really important. Over the last couple of years, I've seen people engage with racial justice who'd never engaged before. I see people who attended Black Lives Matter marches, who marched with us kind of on that day in June in 2020, who had never been on a march before. I saw diehard, what I would describe as pretty conservative evangelicals, actually seeing that this was an enough is enough moment. And of course, we all have to start with our own lived experience. But we quickly need to move on to doing the social analysis, but then beginning, after we've reflected theologically, on addressing oppressive structures. It's really important in this racial justice movement that continues to build, that continues to do the work, that we are changing attitudes. It's really important that we're helping people to be better allies. But most importantly, it's really important that we are enabling systemic change within organisations. And there are plenty of stories of hope. Very recently, a colleague of mine, Shamara Fletcher, who is a millennial leader, works as part of the team with Churches Together England, leads our Pentecostal and Charismatic Forum group, but also leads around racial justice and multi-ethnic affairs, multicultural affairs. And she's been working really quietly in the background with the Quakers. And it was great. A couple of weeks ago, I had the privilege of attending the Quaker yearly meeting, which was a great blessing. I attended it with my colleague from Churches Together in Britain and Ireland, Dr. Nicola Brady. And it was amazing as we were there. And then literally the next day, and I know that someone also had spoken from within their ranks about racial justice, they took the decision to say that they were going to pay reparations. Amazing. That came out of the blue. But what did I learn from that? I learned that sometimes we think our labour in the Lord is in vain. But I tell you, as we sow, so we will reap if we do not faint. And I think that the conversations that we've been involved in with church denomination, with church leaders, with Christian organisations over the years, I want to say there are moments where you think, well, I wonder where any of this is going. But I want to say that our little conversations can make such a huge difference. I haven't got time to tell you all the stories of work that I've done with organisations and just seen how they've made even baby steps in the right direction. I want to move on to the Ukraine crisis because that's huge. And that was huge, particularly for us at Churches Together in England. Between the 14th and the 16th of March, we had our forum with over 300 leaders, church and Christian leaders from the 6 presidencies of CTE. So that's the Pentecostals and the Charismatics, it's the Anglicans, it's the Catholics, it's the 4th presidency, which involves the Lutherans and also the Quakers. It's also the Orthodox church as well, and the free churches are all kind of in the mix there. And as the Ukraine crisis began to break, so we got a phone call over that weekend. I got a phone call from someone who I've known very well, Russell Rook, who said, listen, Mike, the government want to speak to us. And they want to speak to church leaders. And suddenly from the floor of Forum, we found ourselves speaking to the Minister for Refugees, Lord Harrington, who incidentally was being made a Lord in the House of Lords that day. So we met overnight as a group and we crafted some questions. One had come, I think, from someone from the Free Churches. Another person had come from someone from the Salvation Army. And we were able to put those questions to the minister. We were able to craft some statements that then kind of went to government and to those who kind of really needed to hear a unified church position. And literally in the next couple of weeks then, we found ourselves outside the Ukraine embassy, standing with our Orthodox brothers and sisters in a moment of visible public solidarity. And I want to say that the visible public stuff is important in the mix. I know sometimes we don't like to do that, but I want to say we need to get used to protesting. It has its place. But really importantly has been the ongoing work, the stuff that happens behind the scene. And we've been running something called a Ukraine Refugee Roundtable, which brings together a real wide variety of different churches feeding into the mix, standing together in prayer and reflection, standing in solidarity with those who are working on the front line, sharing resources, uncovering incredible good practice. We uncovered some incredible work that the Assyrian Church of the East is doing with over 150 people who have come from Ukraine as refugees, and they're keeping that community together, and they have a hotel where they are looking after them and supporting them right here in London. But most importantly, speaking with one voice. And so we've been able to put questions directly to the Secretary of State, Michael Gove, for housing communities and levelling up. And, it was interesting. I put the questions, and I remember I got the response immediately, and I was really disappointed. And I thought, I'm going to have to report back to this round table, and it's not going to be great news because I don't think they really answered my question. Yet, over the next couple of weeks, suddenly I heard the questions that we had asked in private beginning to get discussed in the public square. Sometimes we think our message has not got through. The really truth is that they didn't have an answer for our question, but what our question has done has thrown up the issue, caused that then to be debated, and then suddenly we see the movement that we wanted to see. Really importantly, is creating space for the right voices to lead the way. I'm really pleased that the key orthodox voices are actually leading the way in this discussion. We've been wonderfully blessed with the wisdom of Father Stephen Platt from an Orthodox church in Oxfordshire, with both Russian and Ukrainian speakers in his congregation. I've already spoken about the work of Bishop Mar Abraham Yukanis from the Assyrian Church of the East. The Redeemed Christian Church of God doing incredible work in some of the border countries with African refugees who've been caught up in the crisis. Reverend Dr. Akpo's been incredible in the work he's been doing as the Ecumenical Development Officer for the RCCG. And for us to be able to get behind them in the work they have been doing has been absolutely critical. But allowing those who are developing best practice on the ground to lead the way. But the important thing I want to say as I draw my talk to a close is this. These are all issues of our concern. But I want to say the issue that is before us right now, this cost of living crisis, which, let's face it, has been building for a long time, none of us can afford to ignore. I want to encourage us all to pile in. It can't just be the job of a few experts. And I love and value the work of organisations like the Trussell Trust. But actually, this is something that is impacting everyone. We know that the poorer you are, the higher your inflation rate. And so while the government might talk about an inflation rate of between 8 and 10%, the truth is the poorest in this country, their inflation rate could be 15 or even 20%. And it's not just about putting food on the table, and it's not just about heating. And sometimes many people are now making a choice between food or heat and light. But how can our churches together become places of sanctuary where people can go, where people can feel supported, where people can eat together, where people can maintain their dignity and yet find that community is being strengthened? I'm going to leave you with a story that during the lockdown and one of the working ecumenically, I get to visit a whole variety of churches, and one of the churches I visit often is Lodge Road Community Church, which is a URC church in Hockley in Birmingham. And during the lockdown, the police knocked on the door. And, when the police knocked on the door during lockdown, you're worried because you think, well, our folks aren't great at wearing masks. We could be in trouble. But no, they knocked and said, we want to give a grant. Because you've been feeding people in this community who are living in houses of multiple occupation that wouldn't eat if it wasn't for the fact that your community cafe and your support groups continued to run during the lockdown. And I wanted to finish with this. When people are in need, they don't queue outside our council offices. They are found outside the doors of our church. And I hope that those doors are open. And I hope our churches in the local community, but also at a national strategic level, are speaking to each other like we are today. Because together, I believe that the local church can bring hope to very needy people in our communities. We have to act together now to build as wide and as deep a coalition as possible if we are to confront the issues that we face as a community. I believe we can do it. I believe that we can make a difference, but it's got to be ecumenically and it's got to be done together. Thank you so much for listening, and God bless you.